Hello and a very warm welcome to the channel. It is time for part 2 of the Second Punic War oversimplified. So this is the big one. This is Hannibal's in Italy, we've got the Battle of Cannae, various other epic victories, some of the most famous military victories in history. We've got the showdown between Scipio and Hannibal. This is like a nerd Super Bowl, basically. A history nerd Super Bowl, I should clarify. So yeah, it should be really interesting. If you haven't already, please do subscribe. Really helps the channel, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
This video was made possible by Incogni. Use code OverSimplified in the link below.
And like VPNs are perfect for history lovers, especially if you still live with your parents or you've got a partner, because you can then watch as many history videos and reactions as you want, and they need know nothing about it. You can tell them you're doing something more socially acceptable, like watching hardcore pornography. So, not from personal experience, to be clear, just something someone else told me, a friend.
For an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Also, make sure to grab our Roman Consul U2s before it's too late. Don't make me mention it a third time, or I'll you know what.
Oh, I see, you're marrying my mum. Honestly, I'll be pleased for her. That's all I can say. It's the father figure I never had.
Hannibal's army had survived its famous crossing of the Alps, and he was now in Italy. With Hannibal's arrival, the Roman consul Scipio hit the ground running. In typical Roman fashion, he marched his army straight at the enemy, and Hannibal began preparing for his first combat with Rome on Italian soil. Before the battle, Hannibal wanted to inspire his men, so he staged a gladiatorial death match between captured Celt prisoners, with the winner getting prizes and freedom.
So I had no idea that the Carthaginians were also into kind of gladiatorial combat to the death. Obviously, very much an iconically Roman thing. Didn't know the Carthaginians practiced it as well, which is interesting. A little bit brutal, to be honest. I guess at least the guy gets freedom, so perhaps in that sense could be worse.
He then explained that the whole thing was a metaphor.
Oh.
Metaphor? For what? You! These warriors are you! You're trapped in Italy with no escape. Your only choice now is to fight and win. What about the dead guy? That's you if you don't win. And the prizes? That's what you stand to gain by winning. And the fact that I've soiled myself in all this excitement? No, that's not part of it.
It's like kind of like the Cortez burning his ships, so there's no possibility of return. Like either you're going to win or you're going to die. And it's crazy to think at this point what the actual makeup of the Carthaginian army was, because as I talked about in the last video, they suffered such massive casualties crossing the Alps and crossing southern France, that they had to recruit a lot from Italian enemies of Rome and to some extent Celtic tribes themselves. So, like the Carthaginian army, which Hannibal was dealing with, must have been this incredibly kind of multinational formation. And Carthaginian armies normally were very multinational; they relied very heavily on mercenaries. So, like the fact that he kept the damn thing together is very impressive.
Part of the metaphor. Okay. Hannibal also smashed in the head of a goat. Again, for inspiration.
Dude's got some problems.
On the other hand, now arriving in the area, opted for the more classic route of a rousing pre-battle speech. Look at them men. Weak, starved by the Alps, while we are the strongest military in the world. This will be easy, like 10,000 horse-sized ducks fighting a baby-sized baby. It'll be like Mike Tyson in his
10,000 horse-sized ducks. Okay, yeah, that is actually quite formidable.
Prime, kicking a baby. A tug of war between 10 sumo wrestlers
and a baby.
Help me out here, Ralph. A baby, sir? Yes!
Yeah.
Yes, that's it! A baby! The point is, there is absolutely no possible way we could lose a battle this easy. So, if everybody's ready, on my mark, charge!
That's a nice field. Oh, I see what's going on.
The Battle of Ticinus was over almost as soon as it had begun, as the Romans found themselves completely outmatched by Hannibal's famed, lightning-fast Numidian cavalry, a key element in Hannibal's devastating double envelopment tactics. In the chaos, Scipio was wounded. Thankfully, according to some ancient writers, his handsome 17-year-old son, Scipio the Younger, saw his father fall. Scipio the Younger supposedly saved his father, and in the process, earned himself a lot of daddy's kisses. The Romans ended up
And then the name Scipio will come back to haunt Carthage later on.
fleeing the area, destroying the bridge behind them as they went. For a nation so overtly confident in victory, believing Hannibal to be an easy kill, the Romans found themselves running away with their tail between their legs. It was humiliating. And do you know who thought so as well? The Celts. They began flocking to Hannibal's side, just as he had hoped. Even Celtic troops fighting for Rome in the Roman camp began to reconsider. Man, I'm thinking we should try to join Hannibal. I hear ya. Maybe we should bring him a gift. What do you think he'd like? Oh, I know. Hey, Hannibal, we want to join your side and we brought you a present. A gift? For me? I hope it's Roman heads. Oh, please be Roman heads. How did you know? Running away from Hannibal was humiliating enough, but having dozens of Romans beheaded in the night,
Ooh,
now that's embarrassing.
this Hannibal guy's got a bloodlust. But this goes back to the earlier point about just how kind of multinational Hannibal's army was, and how much of an achievement it was that he kept it together, especially when the going got tough.
Ticinus had been a relatively small battle, but the psychological impact it had early on was huge, and it was only just a taste of what Hannibal was capable of. Despite the shocking initial loss, however, Rome still didn't seem to fully understand the danger posed by the monster now loose in their territory. The Senate was full of excuses. It's those traitorous Celts. That's why we lost. Yeah, and it was a cavalry battle. Wait until Hannibal faces our almighty legions. And our consul was bold. Once he faces our other fully follicled consul, then he'll really pee his pants. That other consul, Longus, had been in the south all this time, preparing to invade Africa. He had seen some success, even capturing Malta. But then he heard the news. Hannibal's in Italy? And I'm being ordered home? But I was gonna be the big boy.
Yeah.
I was gonna invade Carthage and win the war. Well, you can be a big boy at home. No! Does somebody need a nap, sir? No! 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 And so Longus brought his army on the long journey north. When he arrived in the area to decisively neutralize Hannibal, the two consuls joined their forces together, creating a double consular army. But the two consuls weren't exactly on the same page.
I had a feeling this was going to happen. I mean, there's so many situations in history where when you have like a dual command structure, you just end up with the dual commanders fighting each other. Yeah, I can see the issue here.
Man. I'm wounded, Longus. Pathetic. You don't understand. He's more dangerous than we thought. Maybe for you. Whoops. Listen, we can't just march straight at him like we normally do. We need to train our men through the winter, and we'll try again in spring. Sorry, I don't take advice from a bowling ball. Hey, I'll kick your ass, Longus. Any day now. I'm coming. Just you wait. Oh, Scipio, you feeble old man. Scipio was apparently quite cautious after his recent encounter with Hannibal, while Longus, typically Roman, couldn't wait to give Hannibal a swirly. So who would get their way? Well, when two consuls joined their forces, it turned out the Romans had an interesting system in place. They would each take turns being the one in charge. Consul 1.
That sounds absolutely terrible. Can you imagine that? Like, if you had that system in like the First World War, it's like one general tells you to go over the top, and then next day, someone else's turn. Okay, we're going back, and then we'll go back again, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that doesn't sound perfect.
Would lead one day, then Consul 2, the next. Back and forth, back and forth. As you can imagine, when the two consuls didn't agree, things didn't go so well. In this case, due to Scipio's injury, Longus probably assumed even more command than normal. Hannibal had Celtic spies in the Roman camp. He fully understood the Roman system and Longus's hot-headed nature, and he knew he could exploit it. For goodness sake! What's wrong, sir? I'm trying to order some pizza, but I keep getting fed all these personalized ads about being a hothead. I'm not a hothead, am I? No, sir.
They were
Look at this. Butt insurance.
far worse to
Who
get
would buy butt
personalised.
insurance? Yeah, that's...
There are far worse things to get personalised adverts about, I imagine. No, again, not from personal experience. A friend told me.
Sounds really stupid. Sir, it seems like a lot of data brokers have collected data on you. They could sell that data to Hannibal. What? But don't worry, because you can get...
So I've got a feeling we've got a VPN advert coming up. And the prospect of my data being sold to Hannibal is terrifying. Like, I've seen how he puts on gladiatorial combat for like the amusement of his just to send a message to his troops. He like sacrificed, he like, beat a goat's head in. He celebrated when the Roman heads were brought to him. I don't want to get on the wrong side of this guy. So yeah, use a VPN, people, because otherwise Hannibal could do anything. The guy's an animal.
Number, address, social security number, and favorite color from? Probably a dirty data broker. We could painstakingly contact the hundreds of brokers that have our data and politely ask them to delete it. That process would only take the average human about 3,000 years. And that's why you need Incogni. I was shocked to find how many data brokers Incogni had tracked, potentially selling my data.
It would
But
actually
all I
be.
had to do was create an Incogni
Now he
account,
mentions
give
it.
them permission to work on my behalf.
I'd be quite
and
interested
sit
to know.
back and let them do all the hard work for me. And since
Okay,
these
so
data brokers don't stop there,
it's not actually a
Incogni will
VPN.
continuously work to keep my data safe with an annual plan. So if you want to protect your personal data too, go to incogni.com/oversimplified to get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. That's incogni.com/oversimplified.
It
And
actually
as always,
doesn't sound
you'll
like a
be
terrible
supporting my
idea.
channel.
Though I'm the last person in the
Now,
world
where
to take
were we?
IT advice from,
Oh,
so.
yeah. Roman heads, a double consular army, and a hothead. Hannibal needed to keep smashing the Romans in battle in order to maintain the loyalty of the Celts, and so he was eager to fight another battle. The
You
combined
want
Roman-
some, mate? Yeah. I love the the soccer match. I'm saying that because I know most of you guys are American. The soccer match style.
force possibly outnumbered him, so he carefully crafted a clever trap, and he made sure to spring it while Longus was still in charge. The plan began with his army getting an early night's sleep. All right, boys, time for lights out. Sorry, but we got a big day ahead of us. Tomorrow, we're gonna massacre the Romans. Good night, boys. Dream of revenge.
Well, now they're not going to sleep at all, are they? Yeah.
Gorzog, send out the cavalry.
What's this
That night,
do?
Hannibal's Numidian cavalry made their way over to the Roman camp, arriving just before dawn. Hey, Romans! Wakey, wakey! What the? What's going on? Hey, Longus, your butt smells like a butt. It does not! Scipio, awaken the troops. Longus, these playground insults are clearly meant to lure you out. Well, it's working! Send out the troops. Longus, it's clearly a trap, and I'm falling for it. Send out...
So thinking about it, I mean, the difference in numbers between the first battle and this battle. The first battle was something like 5,000 against 3,500, something like that. Whereas this one is about nearly 40k per army. So that implies that I presume that I guess Hannibal didn't commit his entire force in the first battle because the only other explanation would be that he recruited 35,000 Italians and Celts, which doesn't seem plausible. So yeah, I'm guessing he didn't put his entire army in, but clearly he's recruited a lot of people, and that he's leading a very sort of multinational army, and like commanding such a multinational force would be an interesting challenge.
Out the troops! Hey guys, wake up. You're heading out for battle. What? But we haven't had breakfast. We're skipping breakfast! I don't think you can do that. As the Romans hurried out of camp, the Numidians began luring them back to the Carthaginian camp, where these gentle angels were just awakening from their slumber.
If it turns out like the key to Hannibal's military genius was letting his men sleep a couple of hours longer than the Romans, I'm going to be really disappointed. I'm not going to lie.
Boys, we're having pancakes.
Ooh.
While the Carthaginians were enjoying their hearty breakfast, the starving Romans were still on their way. Hurry up! We have to catch those Numidians. Hey, why have you stopped marching? Longus, there's a freezing river in front of us. Well, get your gluteus maximus in the water! All right, boys, time to lather up. This oil will insulate you from the cold. It also smells like lavender. There's the Carthaginian camp. Get ready to fight, men. Sir, I think the water from the river is beginning to ice over. I can't move. Oh, I'm sorry. You thought war would be fun? Sitting around a nice hot campfire playing Truth or Dare with your friends? Welcome to the real world! Truth. Who do you like? Sharon. Hey,
That is such a Carthaginian name.
guys, the Romans are here. Having perfectly orchestrated events so that his enemy was cold, tired, and hungry, while his men were well rested and covered in oil. When the two sides engaged one another, the
This is starting to
Romans
sound a lot more homoerotic than I was expecting.
were in no condition to fight. And the cherry on top, the previous night, Hannibal had sent out an elite force of men led by his brother to go and hide behind a bush. They suddenly sprung out, encircling the exhausted Romans, who were then cut to pieces. Once again, Hannibal's superior cavalry and double envelopment tactics had flummoxed the Romans. But the key word at
I mean, the relationship between Carthage and Numidia is very interesting because the Carthaginians actually fought the Numidians quite a lot and also employed them as mercenaries and clearly had like a massive respect for their capabilities, particularly obviously as cavalry.
Trebia was control. Hannibal used his intel on the enemy and the environment of the battlefield to carefully control the conditions of battle, creating lots of little advantages for himself that paved the way to success. And concealing troops for an ambush? All of these things are what make Hannibal the genius he's remembered as today. As for Longus, he managed to escape the battlefield with a small number of troops. Disgraced, he didn't want the Senate to find out what had happened, and he began obscuring communications back to Rome. Longus, where have you been? We've been looking for you. Nowhere in particular. Longus, 30,000 men are missing. Do you know where they are? They're taking a bath. 30,000 men? All in a bath? Yes. Longus, what's under that rug? Aurora.
This is one of those problems you get so many times in history where the whole don't shoot the messenger. Like if something bad happens, you kind of need to be out of it because if you try and cover it up, the situation just gets worse.
Borealis? Aurora Borealis? Oh, well, that's my consulship over. Good luck with Hannibal. Bye. Trebia had been a disaster for the Romans. And as even more Celts began flocking to Hannibal, Rome largely lost its control over Cisalpine Gaul. In Rome, complacency turned to alarm. Hannibal had outwitted them on their own soil and inflicted a costly defeat. But with that, Scipio and Longus's terms as consul were over.
Probably
They
for the
were
best.
replaced with two new consuls, Servilius and Flaminius. The Romans may now have begun to realize the trouble they were in and the genius Hannibal had shown in invading Italy. The Romans had expected to be the ones controlling this war. Remember, they thought they were going to invade Carthage. Now their plans lay in ruins, and they were levying 11 new legions to deal with the threat. Hannibal had completely redefined the war.
And this is one of the incredible things about the Roman Republic throughout its history, but including in the Second Punic War, is they had an amazing ability to recreate armies. They could lose a massive army. It wasn't just in this war; it was in other wars as well. They could lose several massive armies and still be able to put several more massive armies into the field. They had an incredible recruitment system, which I guess is probably linked to the way they did citizenship. They had a much larger citizenship base, certainly than the Carthaginians, made them a lot less reliant on mercenaries. But yeah, I don't know the exact reasons. Please, if you do, please comment below.
But Hannibal had a little problem of his own. Things had gone well so far, but the Celts were notoriously fickle, and Hannibal needed to ensure he maintained their alliance and his base of support in Italy. Any Celts he captured fighting for Rome, he treated extremely well and allowed them to return to their homes. But the longer he hung around in their territory, eating all their food and leaving beard trimmings in their sinks, the more resentful they may become. They wanted to go south and plunder some Roman booty, and Hannibal also hoped to sway Rome's other Italian allies in the south to his side. So from here, the path was clear. Hannibal.
Yeah, people forget that to secure Italy itself, Rome had to fight some really brutal wars. Um, the kind of the process by which Rome expanded from being a city-state just to the Italian peninsula was extremely bloody.
Had to move south. Just one problem. There were two main
Etruscans.
routes Hannibal could take to move south. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly where the two new Roman consuls had taken fortified positions. If Hannibal tried to move on them, he'd be fighting from a disadvantaged position and could be bottled in. There is a third option. Ooh, tell me. We could move through this vast impassable marshland flooded with dirty, stinky, disease-infested water that at times would come up to our necks. But there's no way we would attempt that, right? That'd be crazy, right? Hannibal? Hannibal's 4-day trek across the Arno marshlands was hell on earth. Almost as crazy as when he crossed the Alps. Imagine 3 full days, unable to sit or lie down, because there's nowhere to sit or lie down. Meaning 4 full days without sleep, slugging through heavy mud. You contract cholera, your foot falls off, and Jim Bob directly in front of you won't stop pooping in your path. In fact, everybody's pooping in your path. Some delirious, sleepless men would see clumps of mud and say, man, I could just sink into that. And then they would. When pack animals died, it gave nearby men a chance to rest, but only for a few moments before they were whipped back into line. Even Hannibal himself couldn't escape the torture of it. Hey Hannibal, if we see a Starbucks, can we stop? I need to take a leak.
Oh.
What? Geez, Hannibal. Looks like you picked up a nasty eye infection. Normally for this sort of thing, we just wash it out with some clean water. But as you can see, water everywhere. But it's...
I love how the Hannibal story is. It's almost like a story of an epic explorer with a bunch of also very epic battles thrown in. You've got almost 2 genres merging together.
full of Jim Bob's poop. No worries, Doc. I'll just take care of it myself.
Ooh.
That'll be $3,000. When the now possibly one-eyed Hannibal and his army emerged from the swamp, they were shattered. But he had just managed to slip 50,000 men right past the Romans into rich Etrurian lands, where he could replenish his supplies, and his Celt allies could go crazy, securing Roman loot and booty. As fields and villages went up in flames, one Roman consul couldn't help but notice. The hot-headed Flaminius, feeling it was his responsibility to protect these lands, rather than waiting for his co-consul to come join him, immediately left to go chase Hannibal. Now, this Flaminius was an interesting character. He was what the Romans called a new man. He came from the lower plebeian classes of Roman society, and as a result, he reportedly had kind of a screw-you attitude to the establishment, and a big old arrogant chip on his shoulder. Picture Sid Vicious wearing a toga. That's Flaminius. And
That's a very interesting analogy.
Hannibal, thanks to his spies, knew everything. Just as with Longus, Hannibal knew Flaminius was just the kind of man he could lure into a trap. Hannibal led
Know your
Flaminius to
enemy.
the entrance of a narrow pass along the north shore of Lake Trasimene. Flaminius watched as Hannibal's army entered the pass. I've done it. I've spotted the enemy. Sir? That big follow us sign seems kind of like they're trying to lure you in. Yes, Gareth, and I'm taking the bait. Sir, this really seems like a trap. Yes, Gareth, and I'm falling for it. Daylight was fading.
Go get
So
him.
for now, the Romans set up camp. The two armies encamped across the lake from one another, and night fell over the two camps. In the morning, Flaminius would catch up to Hannibal, and he would be the hero of Rome. For now, the Romans got nice and comfy in their beds.
So this time, both the armies are getting... Well, I've got a feeling that might not be quite the case. Nicely rested.
Good night, Flaminius. Good night, Rome. Good evening, Hannibal. During the night, Hannibal ordered total stealth.
Yeah, I had a feeling it wasn't going to be quite a
As
comfortable
tens of
night.
thousands of troops scaled the wooded hills above the pass, completely undetected by Rome's scouts. Let's go, girls. Flaminius took off across the lake shore to try to catch Hannibal. As he did, even the weather seemed to be on Hannibal's side. A thick fog rose from the surface of the lake, obscuring visibility. Look at this! This is perfect! The mist will obscure our approach. Hannibal will never see me coming.
If you managing to hide, if that's correct, my interpretation, tens of thousands of troops, is one hell of an achievement. You got to say that, or just Roman
Sir,
messing
why
up.
does it sound like 50,000 Carthaginians are charging down the hill towards us? You mean 50,000 Carthaginians are charging right into my trap? The Romans found themselves completely hemmed in on all sides. With zero visibility in the fog, the fighting was terrifying and chaotic. Troops were pushed into the lake in their heavy armor, where they were either cut down or drowned. And Flaminius, who likely stood out like a sore thumb in his consul attire, caught the attention of one Celt warrior, with his head possibly swirling with thoughts of how the Romans had decimated his homeland. According to the ancient writers, this Celt took his chance.
Ooh.
In the 3-hour-long massacre, 15,000 Romans were killed, and an equal number captured. An entire army completely wiped out, along with their consul. During the battle, the Roman vanguard had managed to break through at the front and climbed the hill above the fog. When the mist cleared, what they saw was a blood-red lake and a sea of Roman bodies. Worse yet, when the other consuls sent cavalry to try to aid Flaminius's doomed legions, they too were caught and defeated. A double disaster. Rome went into a frenzy. For the second time, Hannibal had completely decimated an entire Roman army. Romans were dying by the tens of thousands. Common citizens began flocking to the city for safety. Women waited by the city gates in tears, hoping to hear news of loved ones. This one man, having just...
Yeah, that's the thing that you kind of sometimes forget. Obviously, because these wars and battles took place so long ago, you almost forget the human element and just how much human cost there was to all these wars. And of course, because this was basically how geopolitics was done at the time, there was very little alternative. Pretty much every civilization engaged in warfare. But yeah, you do forget when we talk about 30,000 men being killed in a day or in a couple of days. For that's an awful lot of people they would have known, and that would have had a really big impact on Roman society.
Led his battered army across the Alps the previous year, now stood less than 100 miles from Rome. To this point, he had been a problem. Now, Hannibal was a crisis.
Yeah.
And in a crisis, Rome took desperate measures. They actually had a system in place when dealing with an emergency of this magnitude. They would forgo their two-consul power-sharing system and instead
A
temporarily
dictator.
give one man near total power and authority to be as decisive as he needed and hopefully salvage the situation. This all-powerful position in Rome's government had a name: dictator.
Yeah.
It's actually where we get the word. But unlike modern dictators, Roman ones didn't score perfect rounds of golf or ride bears to the Siberian tundra. They held their power for just 6 months before they were required to give it up.
Yeah, that's a lot better than King Jong-un, isn't it? Let's be honest.
And in Rome's hour of need, the man chosen to be dictator in 217 BC, one of the most highly esteemed members of the Roman Senate, Fabius Maximus. So how would Fabius, as dictator, confront Hannibal? Well, Fabius understood that marching all of Rome's young men straight into a one-man meat grinder was bleeding Rome dry. Hannibal was clearly too dangerous to face head-on in battle. However, he was also stuck in their territory, with dwindling manpower and forced to live off the land. It wasn't a sustainable position to be in long-term, and he could only remain there for so long. So, if Rome avoided battle with Hannibal to prevent any more crippling losses, and instead simply maneuvered around him, blocking supplies and taking out smaller contingents where possible, Hannibal would gradually become weaker.
And like, if you're prepared as a defending force to retreat and utterly ravage your own territory, It's obviously very damaging to yourself, but it can be even more damaging to the enemy. The person this kind of reminds me of is during Napoleon's advance on Russia, or invasion of Russia, and obviously capture of Moscow. Kutuzov's strategy was most of the time, very occasionally he gave battle, most of the time just to retreat, laying waste to supplies, and then kind of wait for the French to exhaust themselves.
They would gradually become stronger. And so Fabius presented his new idea to the Roman Senate. Okay, guys, I have an idea. See if you can follow me here, okay? Instead of fighting Hannibal, when he approaches,
we run away.
Run away. Fabius's strategy couldn't have been any less Roman. Romans were meant to march headfirst into battle, not run away from it. It seemed cowardly, and Fabius was extremely unpopular. At this point, Hannibal was continuing south. He had to stay on the move to keep his army fed, and he was still aiming to undermine Rome's alliances in the south. As he went, in a calculated display of aggression, he devastated the Roman countryside and killed many Romans, all in plain sight of Fabius and his army. We're just gonna stand here? Yes. Are you a coward? No. But Fabius, that's my farm.
So again, that's another obviously very brutal and I think would agree immoral tactic. But so for example, the Norman invasion of England in 1066, one of the tactics the Normans used was to devastate the countryside around where they landed, which made the English king, King Harold, feel he had to give battle before he was really ready to. Because I presume he wasn't prepared to kind of watch his people suffer, but really he should have done so.
Well, MacDonald, thank you for your sacrifice. You're a hero now. Think of the stories you'll tell. Old MacDonald had a farm.
Yeah.
Shut up. But you know who else hated Fabius's strategy? Hannibal. He understood the danger he was in. Turning Rome's allies against her required Hannibal to keep smashing the Romans in battle. He couldn't do that if Fabius wouldn't fight him. Multiple times, Hannibal tried to goad Fabius into a fight, but Fabius wouldn't bite. Failing that, he tried to turn Rome against Fabius. According to the writer Livy, he burned down all the farms he could, but any farm he learned was owned by Fabius himself. He left well alone. Hey, Fabius, why isn't he burning down your farm? You got some sort of a secret deal with him? But of course not. Hey, Hannibal! What? Burn my farm too, please! What? Burn my farm too, please! No! Remember our secret deal!
Yeah.
Well, you gotta admit, he's a genius. Hannibal's problem, however, was that he had to stay on the move to keep supplying his army from the local lands. At one point, he entered Campania, one of the richest regions of Italy. Great for resupplying, and great for showing up Fabius in front of Rome's South Italian allies. But he was caught in a valley, and Fabius quickly moved to block his escapes. Haha! We've got him! After he's used up all the valley's supplies, he'll starve. Sir? What are all those lights leaving the valley? Is he trying to escape? Lights in plain view. Well, that's a trap if I've ever seen one. And we're falling for it! Suspecting a trap, Fabius refused to budge. But other Romans in the valley rushed to confront Hannibal, only to find the Carthaginian army was actually just a herd of oxen with torches tied to their heads.
Ooh.
They then
How?
found themselves...
Okay, if that it's a miracle they managed to get them to all go in the same direction, right? Like, cows are unpredictable at the best of times. When you set their horns on fire, if they have them, they don't tend to like it.
Caught in an ambush. With the Romans distracted, Hannibal's army was able to slip away into the night, unopposed. Classic Hannibal. For all his inaction, the dissatisfied Romans mockingly dubbed him Fabius the Delayer. But the thing is, Fabius's strategy was probably the best thing he could have done. He was right that constant encounters with Hannibal were bleeding Rome dry, and the time he took
It really reminds me of Kutuzov. I'm sure there's loads of other people who did the same strategy, but that's who comes to mind.
Some breathing room to recover their forces when they desperately needed to, while putting Hannibal into an increasingly more difficult position. Modern historians view Fabius's strategy as generally a good idea. To this day, the act of not engaging an enemy, but instead gradually wearing them down, is still referred to as the Fabian strategy.
Ah,
But
is
when
that where that came
Fabius's
from?
term finally came to an end, the Senate couldn't have been happier. It was time to start fighting again. However, they probably had a little chat about how they were going to go about it. See, Hannibal's tactics up until now had been very sneaky. Or, if you're a Roman, you might say dishonorable. I'm sick of it! Every time we try to take this guy down, we march straight at him. But then, oh no! Hannibal's hiding in a bush. Hannibal's got 30,000 men up a tree. At this point, I'm not convinced my wife isn't just Hannibal wearing a disguise. Cooey. Look, this time we obviously have to switch something up. Now, granted, we're Roman, so we're gonna march straight at him without thinking. That can't be helped. It's in our blood. But I have a proposition. This time, when we march straight at him, we do it with a massive army. I'm talking like 80,000 men. It won't matter what kind of shenanigans he pulls. He can hide in all the bushes he wants. There's no way he can possibly beat off 80,000 men. Grow up! You know what I mean? And so it was. With 2 new consuls,
I'm always a little bit suspicious about the numbers given for the kind of these ancient battles because they're so much bigger than in particularly the early medieval period, particularly in Western Europe. That you just wonder how the Roman Republic was able to put so many more men under arms than, for example, the Kingdom of France. I mean, maybe it's perfectly valid. I'm sure historians have looked into it, and I guess it. I mean, everyone knows the Romans exaggerated their numbers massively. I mean, everyone did at the time. So, especially the numbers they were fighting. But I presume someone's done some work on whether the Romans' numbers for their own troops were remotely reliable. But I just don't totally understand how the ancient armies were able to put so many more men into the field than armies sort of 700 years later.
Rome put together a massive army, the biggest Rome had ever fielded, to put Hannibal away once and for all. To gather the men required, 2/3 of them ended up being completely inexperienced. But how much experience does it take to be expendable war fodder? As this massive army set out in the summer of 216 BC, the Romans knew they needed to win this battle. Just one victory over Hannibal would likely be enough to end his entire campaign. And this time, their overwhelming manpower gave them confidence they could do it. Hannibal had taken position at the town of Canai, where he had captured an important Roman supply depot. With Fabius gone, Hannibal knew a battle was likely coming, and he was eager to fight it on his terms. But when his men looked out at the Roman camp, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. That army's huge! There's no way we can possibly beat off all these men. How are we gonna beat off all of these men? You know what I mean. I think he's right, Hannibal. Hannibal is then said to have replied, Gisco, my friend,
Beat off
don't
as many
worry.
men as we want.
There may be a lot of them, but amongst their ranks, there's not a single man named Gisco. This joke was apparently so funny that his officers began to laugh and laugh. And when his men in the camp heard the laughter, they were like, hey, they're laughing. I guess that means we're gonna win the battle. Hooray! As for the Romans, the consuls were another pairing between an inexperienced hothead and a wise scholar. Although the main historian from this era was good friends with Paulus's family, so take that with a grain of salt. On his day of command,
I mean, that's the other thing about all these ancient battles, or not. Well, not all of them. A lot of them is we have so few sources for our understanding of what actually happened. I mean, there's usually a bit of archaeological evidence, but the sources are so few that we have to make big assumptions about whether they're being reliable or not. And I strongly suspect that quite a lot of what we think we know about ancient warfare is probably not right, or at least the kind of manoeuvrings of individual battles. Anyway, but that's just me getting off on the tangent.
a rash and hasty Varro, despite the apparent pleas from Paulus, sent the army out for battle. And when Hannibal saw this, he did the same. And here comes the single largest battle of the Second Punic War, and one of the most renowned battles in history, the infamous Battle of Cannae. In all the pre-battle maneuvering, Hannibal was able to ensure his army was fighting from the south. This meant the seasonal dust-carrying winds were to his back and blowing directly into the faces of the
So that's the genius of the guy. Any like very small advantage he's able to exploit.
Romans. Like I said, control. After 2 years in Italy, Hannibal's infantry had dwindled to about 40,000. The Romans possibly outnumbered him 2 to 1. Their army was so big that their maniples stretched far deeper than they normally would. The Romans planned to charge Hannibal's thin, weak line like a battering ram and break it. They also chose a narrow battlefield in the hopes it would prevent Hannibal's far superior cavalry from being able to outmaneuver them. They wanted an honorable battle where pure strength, rather than trickery, would decide the outcome. If Hannibal had his say, however, trickery might end up having a lot to do with it. He ordered his line to position themselves as an outward bulge, with his weakest troops at the very center. Just behind them, out of sight from the Romans, stood the elite Libyan infantry, waiting for their moment to strike. The battle commenced as the massive Roman troops smashed into the Carthaginian center. The shape of Hannibal's line ensured the overwhelming weight of the Romans hit his weakest troops first, and they were pushed back. Hannibal's outward bulge reversed inward, with the Romans being funneled in towards the weak center. Hannibal had positioned himself at the center to encourage the troops to hold out as long as possible against the Roman onslaught.
And I guess like the smart thing is if he just had his formation in kind of like a U to start with, as in facing away from the Romans would obviously have figured out what they were trying to do. They're trying to surround us. But because you have some of your men facing forward and then doing a fighting retreat, it's not so obvious what you're trying to do.
Because while the Romans were unleashing carnage on the center, Hannibal's cavalry needed time to do their job. The heavy cavalry on the left, after a barbaric fight, sent the Roman horse packing, with the consul Paulus even sustaining a severe head injury. He managed to move into the center to keep the battle going. Then, the heavy cavalry turned and approached Varro's cavalry from behind. At the first sight of the coming Carthaginian envelopment, Varro ordered his horsemen to flee the battlefield. The Carthaginians had won the cavalry battle.
Yeah, that
But
was
back
an
in the
interesting
center,
move.
according to some accounts, Hannibal's line did eventually end up caving to the massive weight of the Romans, and they began to flee. The Romans pushed deeper, and organization within the army likely broke down as they became a giant mass trying to massacre the fleeing Carthaginians. They didn't realize that they were playing right into Hannibal's hands. At that moment, Hannibal's elite units, having done no fighting yet, and therefore fresh as a daisy, turned and smashed into the Roman sides. Many of these troops were wearing Roman helmets and armor they had picked up after previous battles, and the confused Romans may not have even realized they were the enemy. As Hannibal managed to regain the composure of his center and encourage them back into the fight, the Carthaginian cavalry swooped in from behind. And look at what lies before you. A military general's wet dream, the total encirclement of a much larger force by a much smaller force. The Romans were trapped. Hannibal had unbelievably managed to use their own superiority in numbers against them. Rather than simply encircling them, he had actually allowed them to use their own immense power and push themselves into an encircled position. This was the genius of Canai.
That's
that,
very clever.
the annihilation began. For hours, the Carthaginians slaughtered the helpless Romans from all sides. The terrified Romans were so tightly packed that at times they couldn't even lift their arms to defend themselves. The killing went on so long that the Carthaginians became exhausted from the non-stop massacre, and by the time the butchery came to an end, the grim toll spoke for itself. To Hannibal's several thousand lost, the Romans suffered 60 to 80,000 dead or captured.
I mean, like when you think of what the population of the Roman Republic was at that time, um, I mean, a modern major country, say like France, losing 80,000 men in a war would be a big blow. But France has got 60 million people. I mean, the Roman Republic had a hell of a lot less. Um, so when you realise kind of the populations you're dealing with, that is a mammoth loss of manpower.
Yet another entire army wiped out by Hannibal. Many high-ranking Romans met their end at Canai. Paulus, for one, but also 80 senators and more. It's been estimated that 20% of
Exactly. This is my point. To understand the scale of the blow, you have to appreciate just how sort of relative to what we got, how low the populations were at that time.
Rome's male population, aged 18 to 50, died at Cannae. This was it. Hannibal's vengeance. The stunned Carthaginians, as they searched for their own survivors among the dead, couldn't believe the sight of it. An estimated 30,000 gallons of blood now lay spilled on the battlefield. Rome's defeat at Cannae sent shockwaves throughout Italy. Just as Hannibal had hoped, most of southern Italy now defected to his side, including the second largest city on the peninsula. Wow! Hannibal, this is incredible. What could possibly come next? Next? Jim Bob. I've killed 150,000 Romans. I've turned her allies against her. That's it. That's then.
So again, this comes back to the point that some of the other Italian regions were under Roman control or Roman allies had only very recently come under Roman control or kind of supremacy, and there was a lot more for Hannibal to work with in terms of picking apart Rome, because a lot of it was actually quite a recent creation away from the kind of the central chunk around Rome itself as a political entity.
Vengeance. So let me tell you what comes next. Rome surrenders. Their territories are reduced. We recover our lost islands. And Carthage dominates the Mediterranean once again. But sir, what if they don't surrender? Jim Bob, did you miss what just happened? Of course they're gonna surrender. Throughout his campaign, Hannibal had shown himself to be very adept at reading the Roman mind. But if he now thought that Rome might surrender, it was the first time he severely underestimated them. And he was about to discover an extremely inconvenient fact about Rome. Rome never surrenders. At a Roman survivors' camp near Canai, one young officer overheard some troops discussing how they would flee Rome. Drawing his sword, he threatened to cut down any man that would abandon Rome in its hour of need. That officer was Scipio the Younger. But soon enough, the Romans would come to call him Scipio Africanus, the hero of Rome.
Oh, okay. So I assumed we're going to do the entire rest of the Second Punic War. Okay, well, yeah, as I said, Scipio becomes a very important figure. We will, I'm sure, get on to how the Romans managed to defeat the Carthaginians later. Obviously, one key factor, we've already discussed this, is that the Romans were incredibly good at tanking losses. Lose an army, make another army. Lose an army, make another army. And to a certain extent, they could out-fatigue almost anyone at this time, which was, I think, partly because of the way their political system worked with citizenship, and the kind of the advantages that came with that, and also the obligations that came with that in terms of military service. But yeah, that was really interesting. I will doubtless do part 3 when we get to it. I don't know if they could, maybe they can do the Third Punic War as well. I mean, that one was fairly short. It was pretty much just a sack of Carthage, but perhaps we'll get there. It'll be interesting to see. But yeah, I say thank you so much for watching. It would, if you've not subscribed, please do. It might improve the quality of your day. You never know. And have a great rest of your week.